Latinx is essentially, very much a U.S. bound term. It's fraught language. It's a fraught word. The most recent polls, and I believe they were sort of made by Pew in 23, show that just 51% of folks to whom the term might be applicable actually have heard of it. And of those, about 4% actually have it as a preferred term. Someone laughingly told me the other day that about 90% of that 4% is probably in the art world.
Hello and welcome back to the MO podcast. My name is Jonathan Neal and I am here as always with my co-host Joey Flores. And today we are speaking with Christian Viveros-Fauné. Christian is a friend of mine, long time. We go back in the annals of art writing. He's a writer, a curator who I've known for many years. I think our first encounter was probably back in the mid-2000s. When you were making a detour through the belly of the art market as a dealer and a founder of a gallery that I very much admired, the program of which was called Roebling Hall. Nevertheless, Christian has had bylines in pretty much every major art world outlet and in most of the mainstream press that still takes art seriously. He's curated, by my count, more than 20 museum exhibitions, continues to do so today as Curator-at-Large for the University of South Florida's Contemporary Art Museum, where he's just opened last week a show called The X Factor, Latinx Artists and the Reconquest of the Everyday. He's the author of a number of books, most recently one called Social Forms, A Short History of Political Art, which we'll talk about. That was published by David Zwirner Books. And as the art critic for the rebooted Village Voice, he has recently written a piece titled The Culture of Complaint 2.0, White Guy Wants His Museum Back, about which he and we will have much more to say. Christian, welcome to the MO podcast.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joey. Lovely to meet you. Thanks for the very kind introduction.
We'll get to that piece in the Village Voice, which, like the piece that generated it by Dean Kissick, was also sent to me by numerous friends and colleagues as a fantastic entry into the art criticism wars, to the extent that there might be something like that. But for fear that might crowd out our other discussions, I want to start first with the exhibition that you just recently curated and opened in Florida. Tell us a little bit about the X Factor, your intentions for it, and in particular, what it was like trying to put together this show at a time when the term like Latinx has become a kind of focus for everything that was either right or wrong about political messaging and cultural politics.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a curious time to be doing this, obviously. Latinx has had, as a term, has been problematic. And that the problematics of that term were very much on view during the election. Clearly, the idea of Latinity in the U.S., this is very much a U.S.-bound exhibition, right? There are 15 artists, all of Latin extraction, all of whom live and work in the U.S. Latinx is essentially, very much a U.S. bound term. It's about the sort of experience of, again, Hispanics, Latinos, those two terms being sort of the previous terms to Latinx, to what sort of Latinx wants to be. Yeah, it's a fraught. It's fraught language. It's a fraught word. The most recent polls, and I believe they were sort of made by Pew in 23, show that just 51% of folks to whom the term might be applicable actually have heard of it. And of those, about 4% actually have it as a preferred term. Someone laughingly told me the other day that about 90% of that 4% is probably in the art world, which, makes some sense to me. But in any event, and before we went on the air, I was just saying to you that out of these 15 artists, all of whom have done a tremendous job, not just in our show, but in their careers of again, subtitle of the show, reconquering the everyday through in their work. Yeah, each one of these artists five of them on the day of the opening in a panel that we had, none of them felt particularly comfortable with the term. Um, some of them because, at least one of them because they live in Puerto Rico and they identify basically as a Puerto Rican artist. Another one who happens to be, well, Rodrigo Valenzuela, who's over in your neck of the woods because he's among other things, the chair of the photo department at UCLA, and is a fellow Chilean. I was born and still travel on Chilean passport, though I've been living in the States for most of my life. Yeah, he'd been identifying as a Chilean artist up until fairly recently. Though he sort of said on the panel that, well, maybe, maybe with the recent political term, it's my term now. It's my time to actually sort of take this thing on board and consider myself an American artist, maybe a Latinx artist. I don't know. But it was really interesting to me that, all of these people have work in institutional collections at major museums on both coasts and in the middle, and they also have problems with the terminology. So part of the idea of the show is to capture one, the reconquesting of sort of the everyday, right? Of the way they take their multiple identities and sort of reframe everyday things from, I don't know, the everyday vision, right? In the case of someone like Lucia Yarrow, there are a couple of very poppy Oldenburgy type sculptures, the kind that she's known for, and they're essentially sort of reinterpreted, monumentalized. With Valenzuela, again, they take on, they're essentially sort of studio photographs that look like, I don't know, like a warring version of Toy Story, for lack of a better term. And he sort of cycles ideas of historical ideas of labor through them. Narcisa Martinez, who folks who out in your neck of the woods should probably know or will probably know, is largely about doing, well, for lack of better term, social realist portraiture on top of found material, specifically produce boxes that are found in supermarkets, right? He shows with Charlie James. In any event, so part of the idea of the show is capturing that, right? Capturing the way, again, the second largest, or rather the first largest minority group in the U.S. sees, right, their experience, right, Latinity, out in the world, but specifically the U.S. And the other, this coinage in flux, right, and how it applies or sort of doesn't apply. I think it's sort of interesting that, we got a small and nonetheless generous NEA grant, but curiously, I think the bigger granting institutions, I think, didn't really understand our argument for this term being in flux, right? That's my reading of it. People who we expected might be keen to sort of support the show didn't. And I do think that has to do with sort of the ideological moment we're in. It was either you're all in or you're not.
Is that, you mean all
And
in?
the gray has been a problem now for a while. And there's a way in which, I think this show, other shows that I do, the writing I try to sort of do is largely about the gray,
Right.
you know?
So what you're saying is that you think trying to bring some of that subtlety or trying to bring some of the question into the idea of this term and the terminology, rather than it being a sort of full-throated defense of it as a term and as an identity, is something that was maybe challenging to funders to accept.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious from the standpoint of mounting the exhibition itself, or even from the very beginning, Florida itself is a very interesting place from the standpoint of the way that the new administration and its various different foot soldiers have approached expression, academic freedom, particularly with regard to universities, and knowing that this is a university art museum. I'm curious, what was the environment like for you and your colleagues as you were thinking about putting on this show and how it was being put on, and whether a lot of that kind of, whether it was background noise or whether it was very sort of upfront in the way that you were approaching an exhibition that looks at a kind of identity that could be um, a target for a kind of anti-identitarian ideological, which I think for many people also is just, cover for a different type of identity politics. But I'm curious from you, what was it like on the ground as you were sort of conceiving and organizing, beginning to work on this, knowing the complexities of higher education, administration, politics, and everything else, and how that might have been doubled in a place like Florida?
It's totally doubled. I mean, Florida is the land of the Stop Woke Act. It is the place where, faculty have to worry about their students, taping them on their phones and having a direct line to Florida legislatures. And, there have been accusations from those instances, that have gotten faculty in trouble and have gotten departments in trouble. So, as a matter of fact, I don't remember who it was in the Florida legislature that advanced sometime last year the idea that Latinx should actually be struck off all legal documents produced by the state, right? Which would, of course, include state-funded universities. That didn't pass, so we get to use it in our title. But look, I in Florida more than most places, we're very much aware of the fact that we live in a censorious climate. It's I would say censorious on both ends, but in Florida for sure, and nationwide at this point, with the new president and the new administration, we know who's holding power now, right? So there's effective power and there's symbolic power, and effective power clearly is better at not only exercising censorship but basically applying the law, and penalizing free speech often, right? So yeah, it's a real concern. Did that specifically hog tie me in any way, or the institution, or no, it didn't. Were there pressures exercised? No, there weren't. And I have to say that my institution and my director, Margaret Miller, has long led a small but mighty museum to do the kinds of things that no other institutions do in that area, and from the get-go. I mean, her first exhibition was Vito Acconci in a closet sometime in like the 1970s, because there was in a closet essentially because there was no museum to speak of. That was the quote unquote museum at the time.
And we know Akanji likes enclosed spaces.
He likes enclosed spaces, correct, and he likes sort of fighting like a Houdini out of like a out of difficult times, difficult spaces. But yeah, so nothing but support. But the one thing I would say though is that in environments like ours, and let's go back to the 2016 election to speak of sort of a span of time where the culture wars have really sort of heated up. Yeah, those self-censorship is as big a problem as actual sort of censorship from any side. There are things that people decide not to do, choices they decide not to take on, because doing so is often troublesome at the very least, or can get folks in trouble, or can divert their careers or end their careers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a long-winded way of saying No and yes. No in a very specific way, meaning no one actually has exerted pressure to get us to do one thing or another, though that could happen,
Yeah.
right? Um, uh, but there are always sort of elements where of self-censorship where you're wondering what the move is. And in fact, I actually decided to omit a couple of things I mean, this is very small, but I found it important from the wall text that I kept in the brochure, because I figured, okay, the deep divers are actually they deserve this information. Everyone deserves this information, but they deserve this information here. And I might actually sort of avoid a stupid and unnecessary clash, from, I don't know, for example, the cop who's walking in, to see what's going on and takes offense, right? Because that kind of thing has happened, even in our institution. And, taking on, DeSantis from the POV of a curator at the University of South Florida Contemporary Art Museum is a fucking mug's game. It's not a smart play. I mean, let's be honest here. We all sort of want to speak truth to power, but part of speaking truth to power is knowing the hill, is knowing picking your battles and knowing the hills that you're actually going to want to die on.
Christian,
Not enough principle.
Have you ever gotten like a terse reaction from somebody, or like you just gave this example of the police officer walking into the exhibition and finding something to find objectionable? Have you ever gotten like a counter response to something that you curated or something in a show, and you were like pleased with that outcome?
You know what? That's a great question. I get it more than anything else about my writing. And we all know what comment sections, the way they behave. I get stuff on Instagram. I have not gotten actually, a couple of people have written into the museum to say that they object. And on a couple of occasions about one thing or another, on a couple of occasions I've written them back. But that's been it.
Let me guess, the people who write into the museum are over 50 and the people who write into Instagram are under 50.
I think you've got the demographics, dead on right, as they say.
What, not to well, I want one more question on this topic, and then I want to shift over to the larger category of political art. But what do you hope, to a certain extent, this exhibition is just open, what do you hope from the audience experience of the show, and what is the feedback, or what kind of response would, in your mind, be satisfying or signal a kind of very successful outing for these artists at this show at this time, particularly given that the new administration has just come online and this week, and it's promising to be an interesting moment?
I mean, I think for me, in terms of what I wanted to do with the show, since I was having trouble actually framing the idea of Latinx, that's actually what brought me around to consider doing it in the first place. And in this panel that I had on Friday with these 5 artists, and thankfully a full house, which was magnificent, and not just people from the university, because it's boring as all get out. I actually had to sort of issue a confession at the end, and the confession was that I had found myself reluctant to do a show about Latinx, for years, basically because I knew of the actual practical unpopularity of the term, and its sort of in-house life, right? The fact that it seemed to be used and develop easily, almost, within a cultural clique. But the longer I sat with the idea, and the longer I sort of thought through the problems, the more it seemed obvious to me that it needed to be sort of taken on. And the way I think we decided to take it on is, essentially by, having artists take it on rather than have an institutional curatorial sort of overlord make a statement about what it is, we put together what we think, is a show of, you know, possibly 15 of the most important American artists who fill this brief and have them sort of like give us the potential definitions of what this thing is. And I do see genuine value in the idea of Latinx. I really do. I wrote in my sort of introductory mini essay that the term is like a sapling. It has a lot of room to grow. And out of all the terms that are around, then they're not that many, right? There's 3, 4. Again, it's Hispanic, right? These are all sort of census terms. Latino, which is sort of the feminine version, and then this Latinx thing, which basically sort of popped up in the aughts, within the academy. It gets a new life, or it gets a public life after the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting. That's actually sort of when it flares into sort of public view. And becomes used largely online, largely by the demographic you were mentioning, John. And then it starts encountering sort of the cultural resistance that we sort of all know about, right? But as a term, it is really about sort of, the best definition or the best working definition of intersectionality, which is another loaded term. And that is 2 or 3 or more, identities sort of wrapped in one. And so by necessity, somebody who's Latinx is clearly, I don't know, born in Ecuador, parents from Ecuador, Spanish speaking, right? But they may be Black, they may be gay, they may be non-binary in some other way. There are any number of sort of variations on this. Jesus Aldamundo, I know they're sort of California-based artists, LA-based artists. If I remember correctly, father's Chicano, right? Mexican American, though I'm not sure how many generations, and the mother is of Japanese extraction, and her father, that is Shizu's maternal grandfather, if I've got this right, was in a Japanese concentration camp during the war. That's a lot of identity, the defining thing is that it's US based. And one of the other interesting things that we talked about, because there was a point of objection expressed with some anger by somebody in the crowd, somebody who I believe was a faculty member, a Latin American faculty member. She sounded vaguely Brazilian, though I'm not sure I got the accent right. And the objection was, why were we talking about this term? Why weren't we talking about the work? And why did we always sort of like, genuflect towards this kind of US experience when there was all kinds of Latin American art made in all kinds of different ways by all kinds of people? Well, I did have to remind her that, if she had read the memo, she would have realized that the show was essentially circumscribed geographically, by the US, by being Latin in the US. That was the experience. But that, I as again, passport carrying Latin American, I'm tremendously aware of the fact that terminology like Latinx or certain kinds of concerns, particularly identitarian concerns, North American identitarian concerns, have a way of, let's just say, not traveling well beyond the borders of the US. They don't mean the same thing in the UK. They don't mean the same thing in Argentina. They don't mean the same thing in Chile, and they certainly don't mean the same thing in Lagos, Nigeria. Though the assumption from the part of the putative left, and particularly the academic left, is that they do, and they always do. And that is a piece of neocolonialism.
For sure.
I'm very much aware of that, but it's hard to get I should have put this fellow travelers to see the same thing,
Christian,
Yeah, go ahead, Joey.
before we jump off into any other topic, I'm just curious, how would you contrast like the mindset? I realize it's possible to generalize, but sort of the mindset of the Latin artist in the United States versus that in, say, Chile, where you're from. Like, yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit about the differences you see in the way that they think or want to be represented or identity or whatever.
And that's a great question. And I think I can illustrate it in rather quickly. The mindset of the artist of Latin extraction in the US responds to largely to their experience as an insider and outsider in American culture, right? Which of course is the overriding, out of all the global cultures, it is the most powerful. It's the one that exports best and most. The POV of the artist working in Santiago or Valparaiso or wherever in Chile, and extend this out to somebody working in Buenos Aires or somebody working in Rio or somebody working in Lima, is pegged to their experience. Chileans, for example, have a very difficult time not invoking our 9/11, which was the September 11th 1973 coup d'etat, and then the 10 years of dictatorship of basically the abrogation of civil society for a solid decade and the repression and the death that followed. That is an experience that Chileans have great difficulty sort of avoiding in literature, in theater, in film, and certainly in the visual arts. It's gotten a little easier with people who have no sort of people with generations that don't have an actual living historical memory of that period, but it is almost a go-to, if you know what I mean. In the same way that, or in a similar way, sorry, as slavery, and the Civil War are a go-to for Black artists in America. There's a trauma there. There's a historical trauma that, is often an overriding experience, that and its legacy. Now, I don't know of a single, well, if I make myself remember, I will think of an American artist who has referenced Chile's September 11th, right? But as you and John and I know, they are very much in the minority. That's not the great drama, right? Is that clear?
What makes in your mind a work of political art? You have a book for whom this term is in the title, Social Forms, A Short History of Political Art. And I asked that question in the context of thinking that there may be something that makes a work of art itself political, but may not rise to the moniker or the category of being political art. So I'm curious, when you wrote your book, how were you thinking about work that was included as political art and that's informed the way that you curate and how you think about that term today?
I think there's no exhaustive way to actually do this, and it's a mug's game to try and basically sort of set up you can set up working definitions, but not a definition per se.
What's the center of gravity? What's the center of gravity?
The center of gravity is contingency, but you could say that Baudelaire's painters of everyday life were also sort of dealing with similar contingencies, and in fact, some of them were making very, very political art. Manet certainly was, and so in social forms in the book, it sort of what I try to establish is something akin to sort of a through line from Goya to Delacroix to, I don't know, man, like Turner to Guston, Hans Hake, Adrian Piper, Jenny Holzer, through Richter, all the way to the present. Do those artists always make political art? Some of them do. Richter, clearly not the case, among others, right? but Richter has made some remarkable works of political art.
Sure.
Uh, um, yeah, look, so I think that the thing about I was talking about this to someone in the studio yesterday whose work is at first glance, it would be hard to describe as political. But that painter and essentially what they're doing is, and I'll mention his name. His name is Dean Monogenes, and he's got a show coming up at Chipas in Paris. Not a guy who gets a lot of play in the States, but again, the States and New York can be provincial. And so, he's got these, how should I put it, sort of vaguely updated Magritian paintings of large promontories. And he said, I see a lot of politics in this, and as we discussed, I could see how he might think that. They weren't overtly political, but they were at least philosophical in the way that Magritte's work might be. And we landed in talking about Morandi, bizarrely enough, who I've always said in my lectures, particularly the lectures I did around social forms, the book, and then later social forms, the exhibition, because I did a biennial out in Portland, Oregon in 23
right.
that had the same title. Because I couldn't leave well enough alone with a single title. Clearly, I didn't think he'd gotten the exposure it needed. And so, so Morandi, is a cat who sat out 2 world wars, basically painting wee little bottles and, tabletop objects in his kitchen with his 2 sisters fucking roaming around. And where's the politics there? Well, sometimes it's politics by omission as much as by commission. And the fact that he actually sort of sublimated all that chaos, all that suffering into these, I mean, obviously anything that's rendered 2D, either in a photograph or any picture, is mute, right? Unless they got speakers on it. But it essentially mute figures that are almost unyielding in their sort of narrative offering, but they're tremendously orderly, and they're also dark-ish. They're gorgeous, but they're dark-ish. There's a piece of, I think, historical or sublimation. There's a piece of sublimation of a wealth of contingencies, if one can put it that way, that those pictures offer up. I don't think I gave you a very specific
That's all right.
answer.
We've got time. We can continue. We can continue.
You're gonna trap me. You're gonna corner me again.
Yeah. No, I mean,
Okay.
it's a way into the question. I think, I appreciate you bringing into the conversation artists whose sort of on first glance would not be considered political in any way. And I think this goes to, there have been arguments throughout the 20th century for a kind of abstraction itself, certainly at the hands of someone like Greenberg, or even more esoterically at the hands of someone like Adorno, is in itself political insofar as a kind of radical autonomy and separation from the world would seem to be a political position that is available to an artist to either commit to or not, warily or not. And so there's an exercise of a kind of interpretation that can be brought to bear on some of that work that I think allows for, let's say, a political reading. But for most consumers,
but then there's Motherwell.
Yeah, right.
Who's overtly political as he's making these abstract works. And the other thing to consider with sort of ab-ex is that, a significant number of ab-exers, Pollock included, have as their sort of aesthetic learning Mexican muralism.
Of course.
And so I think there's I think there's a primary reading and then a secondary reading. I would say like Greenberg's very popular reading is still a secondary reading. The primary reading being the artist reading.
Yeah.
I think they essentially really genuinely felt that advancing art within the envelope of art and within its history was as radical a proposition as anything that went up,
For sure.
yeah,
For sure.
that Orozco and Tamayo
For sure.
and Rivera did.
Yeah, and I think I think that is a often for people coming to that material or similar material, it's more difficult to see that reading on the face of it, obviously, because it requires, something of the kind of the secondary reading that you describe, right? I mean, it requires a little bit of background. And I think that's different than, for example, one of the works that you bring up often would be something like Guernica, right?
Yeah,
Like there's the Picasso of form and experimentation and from cubism to neorealism and back and whatever you want to describe it. But there's no doubt that Guernica is itself a political project from the
absolutely.
get-go, right?
Yeah,
Intentionally.
absolutely. Yeah,
The artist that you just mentioned earlier, Narciso Martinez, right?
yeah,
Like is I think an interesting case too, beautiful work, incredible kind of social realist bona fides, an attempt at a kind of update of form insofar as these drawings are being done on these highly kind of precarious materials, and there's something about that materiality that then reflects into the precarity of the people that are being represented and the histories that are being produced there. And so I think that there's a and on the face of it, even Narciso, I think there is a politics.
and the anger and sorry to cut you up, but
Go ahead.
also the logo types.
Right, right,
That
right,
essentially it's social realist portraiture of U.S. farm workers,
right,
the large majority of whom are U.S. based but not U.S. born and not U.S. citizens, and agribusiness,
right, right,
sun-kissed,
right.
whatever other sort of
Hugely very important point, right? Like I mean that
nature fresh.
the background material is cardboard as much as it is the kind of industrial farming and
Right.
labor practices that underwrite those brands, right?
Everything on the same surface.
Right, right. Everything on the same surface. And I think that there's a, you know, there's an overt politics of content there, and
Yep.
then there is the less overt politics of form. And I've often thought about those divisions. And I think what we were talking about earlier, there's a politics of form to the work of someone like Pollock or Motherwell. There's a politics of form perhaps to Morandi as you were sort of describing,
Yeah.
but it's not the content. And I think most people go to content first, right? And I think most people sort of think content first is the thing that defines something as political art or not. Um, and I'm curious to ask you, do you see a decrease or there's a less of a capacity for people to be able to read form than they have been in the past? And I bring this up only because also your curatorial projects and your writing projects, social forms, right? And
Yeah.
also someone who's obviously important to me in terms of an intellectual development was Frederick Jameson, and the great project that he'd been working on up until the point that he passed away was the poetics of social forms, right? But it seems to me that if there's something that is lacking today in our ability to address politics in art and culture, it's the ability to read form, to understand form and how it works. And I'm curious from your standpoint if you have seen that same issue, and not to, preempt the conversation or to push it in that direction, but I think that was also part of the challenge with the article that
But the
you
Kissick, yeah, that
responded
was
to,
the
the Kissick
Kissick.
article too.
Yeah.
Is a real sort of challenge in understanding how form works, what form is, how it channels politics, how it doesn't, and so forth. So
I don't accept that. I really don't.
yeah,
I mean, I'm seeing lots of different work out there, and work that has overt politics in it is just some of the work. Um, and then we come out to sort of, work that has overt politics, some of which works, and a lot of it doesn't, and that's no surprise to me because I don't think it's any surprise to any real working critic. You move into sort of, eras of one sort of one sort of art idea being dominant. And, what is it? I wouldn't I don't know what the percentages are, but let's just say that 90% of it is largely garbage and 10% is something else, and out of that 10%, maybe 3% is really, stuff that should last if it can, under the right conditions. We do, I think, go through these cycles of form and content, though when things are looking rosy, sort of socioeconomically and culturally, form tends to be sort of, a a a a surer vehicle, you know. Maybe that's one of the reasons why it probably, and I haven't done a kind of breakdown, though maybe I should, of post-war art in these terms and cycles of form versus content. But I would be willing to guess that the form versus content cycles, you have a lot more cycles of sort of heavy duty form in the US, particularly in the market, than you do. It's opposite. We're now going through one of those sort of content phases. We certainly did post-pandemic, especially with, after George Floyd. And it's not just a George Floyd thing, it's a George Floyd thing that was happening again within, a larger sort of context, that included having Trump as president. And, essentially a heavy duty right-wing populist that tilted the globe over in that direction. I was sort of like typing through I'm sure like you guys, I keep a long and too long list of quotes that I'd sort of put together. And there's the Kenneth Tynan quote. I don't know if you guys remember Kenneth Tynan. He used to write for he unfortunately wrote Old Calcutta, which, it was a terrible fucking play, even for people who like Broadway. But he was a terrific theater critic, and for a long time. I forgot where he started. Did he start in Time? Anyway, but he was at Vanity Fair. So, he in writing about Ernest Fisher's The Necessity of Art, a book. This is probably in the early 80s, I'm guessing. He writes, in the arts, form tends to be conservative and content to be revolutionary. It's novelty of content that precedes demand and imposes novelty of form. He's proposing the idea of content really sort of being the ultimate driver. I'm not 1,000% he's right, but I like the idea, and it makes some kind of sense to me. Again, we were shifting. We were working with a shifting idea of what a US-based Latin artist might react to, and then a Latin American-based Latin artist might react to. It's very much about the framing. It's very much about the context. It's very much about how contingencies are felt and experienced. Not just by individual artists, but by the overall culture. And I think that in places outside of the US, trauma has sort of been, a larger carrier of meaning. Where you can get an artistic class, because not in every, you can't get an artistic class in every country. I don't know how many working artists Sudan has, but right. I'd be willing to argue probably not very many. But look, so, there are a lot of ways to also sort of work with social import, right? The standard issue way, or the way we generally tend to see in museums, right, which are repositories of visual culture, is the symbolic version, right, where we see images of one sort or another, or sometimes not even images, recognizable images, let's say. In the case of Motherwell, who we mentioned before, just sheer abstraction, still an image. That symbolically mean, one thing or another. And by the way, they don't always mean left politics. I think this is something that I think is important to mention. There are right-wing artists and right-wing writers, and they get play too. in certain historical periods, sometimes overwhelmingly so. Um, uh, and then there's, stuff that sort of moves differently, which we've come to, which I think has always been around, but that, since, the early to mid 90s, we've come to call socially engaged work, right?
Hmm.
As awkward as that terminology is. And that's essentially work that's looking to activate social processes, right? To work with actual human beings in the world and push them this way and that. Before that terminology was adopted, you still had stuff like that happening. I mean, Boyce's creation of the Green Party, in fact, a
Hmm.
lot of Boyce's work is nothing but that. It just sort of happens, whatever, avant la lettre. A lot of Rauschenberg stuff happens that way.
Hmm.
If you think of Rocky, for example, his one-man sort of like State Department, which he almost went broke self-funding, you know, between like 1984 and like 1992, where he went to 11 countries, 11 sensitive countries, which, by the way, included Chile and China and the Soviet Union and Malaysia, um, and East Germany. And yeah, he 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 landed sometimes like a Martian in many of these places, but brought them sort of the most cutting edge art around, you know, um, basically his own, but also work that had been made in different countries. I mean, that's a fascinating project, but that is nothing if not sort of socially engaged
Hmm.
art, you know.
Yeah. What?
Christian,
Yeah, go
Yeah.
for it.
I hope this doesn't diverge too much from what we're talking about here, but when you talk about the history of political art, um, let's say going back, only as far as perhaps like the early 20th century, maybe the World Wars or something, but like, and from then until now, can you provide some examples where a political art or a movement within political art actually, in your opinion, meaningfully changed the trajectory of history or had an impact on, sort of, yeah, ultimately like the course of history, and not just discourse, but actually like meaningfully changed outcomes in terms of, where the world was headed.
Muralism, Mexican muralism, you know. Um,
What
it
was the impact there?
Well, the impact was actually in a country that was, I don't know what the percentages were, but I'm sure it had a literacy rate that was below 40%. It took, pictures of not just the revolution per se, but ideas of liberation out into the world. And by the world, I mean, outside of the whatever it was, 40% of people who were literate, right? It propagandized the revolution, often with great subtlety and not just as propaganda per se. It gave people an actual sort of picture of themselves. Now, I do think that it's even with the Mexican muralists, um, and I don't know that anyone's done a study, and I'm not even sure how one would go about harvesting the political effects of Mexican muralism, but I think you'd find it you'd be hard put to find historians who wouldn't agree that it was a fundamental part um, of that period in Mexican history. Yeah, I'm trying to think of other analogs. I mean, I guess Guernica did something similar. Not just for the Spanish Civil War, but for the notion of being against wars. I mean, the way it's usually pegged is that Guernica is the first anti-war painting, and that's probably right. You know, um, Hans Hacke has this line, which I'm attracted to and also want to push away. And that is that the way that political art, according to him, works is like an Alka-Seltzer in a glass of water. Um, you have an effect. It's just so diluted, you can't actually try and figure out like where, the effect happens, right? But it's there. It's in the water. Muralism is there. It's in the air. It's in history. But like most art, by which I would extend out from the visual arts to cinema and books, it's mostly experienced one pair of eyes at a time. Um, though unlike books, it can be seen by, masses of people. I mean, I guess the analog and the pre-modern analog would be, the kind of arguments that are made about Renaissance painting. Renaissance painting in its own way it certainly had its politics, right? But it could be said to be political precisely because it did the kinds of things that I'm suggesting the Mexican muralism did in Mexico, and actually beyond. You have Mexican muralism happening in Detroit, and you have Mexican muralism happening in California, and you have Mexican muralism happening all the way down in Concepcion in Chile. These guys not only managed to sort of capture the revolution in murals and paint, and make paint sort of an eloquent vehicle for those ideas, but they managed to do it on at least two continents,
Well,
the length and breadth of them.
I'm excited that was your example because I'm living in Oaxaca, Mexico right now, and this weekend I painted my first outdoor mural here. So, yeah, that's a now it makes me think I should have painted something
direct action,
less cliche, a little more profound. Probably would have been good.
Well, I'm jealous of you living in Oaxaca.
What, Christian, what do you think is, obviously, I think everyone needs to remember that, like, not, that even during times of great political or historical consequence, not every artist should be focused on, making the same kinds of commentary or making the same kinds of work. But what do you think is the role of artists who do want to push, or bring attention to issues like, in a heightened political climate like the one we're in right now? What do you think is the role of artists, who create work like you've outlined in your book during moments like this?
Far be it from, I mean, it sounds like I got a lot of answers, right? But I don't have an answer for every artist. I do think, the challenge of times like these is to step up to the plate as much as you can within your own program, and register some of the contingencies, in whatever medium that you're working in whatever way that you can, with whatever tools your project gives you, or you've selected. How should I put this? It's if the times you're living in, if they present moments of, great injustice, I do think it behooves most people to at least pay attention, and for those who are sort of professional communicators to actually take those messages on board. And I'm actually sort of saying this in a way that I think that I intend to be not just for artists. I mean, one of the things I unfortunately lived through as a Chilean was, having a family that was largely split among political lines, and one side of my family, my mother's side of the family, basically had to live their life from 73 or 74 on in exile. And most of the other folks on my father's side of the family, who were far better off, lived in country, often ignoring or, willfully ignoring or doing worse, what was a significant sort of state-sponsored killing spree, and in a situation of great repression. These are human Um, these are very much human reactions to instability, to turmoil. Um, but I do think it's in the power of communicators, right? And I think particularly in the power of visual artists, who I really think live in an environment because making pictures, making paintings, and making videos, and even socially engaged works, it answers to no real logic, even economic logic. The stuff is so seemingly useless societally that like I think it's a true it's a genuinely radical laboratory in which you can do anything, you know. But when you're given that kind of freedom and you're up against those kinds of contingencies, I think it speaks to the responsibility and the value and the strength of people who manage to somehow or other register, you know. That's a very long-winded answer, but
I want to pick up on that, and this will be a good way of getting into your cultural complaint article and the Kissick article as well, because I think that what you've just described is of art as a kind of privileged open space in which almost anything can be can enter its purview, right? This kind of omnivorous uh, activity where any administrative, legal, political, aesthetic, cultural type of material can kind of enter the gaping maw of whatever contemporary art practice is and can be chewed up and spit out and formed and have something done to it in order to kind of become legible as an artistic practice.
mm,
Um, it occurs to me as you've been talking about Latin America and other places that often some of the most compelling work, some of the most sort of interesting experiments come not out of, environments of openness, right? But come out of environments of restriction, of challenge, of censoriousness and what have you. And I think
yeah.
to the extent that there's something interesting about it, there was a moment over the last decade where I think there were people who, depending on what side of these politics you were on, felt like there was an incredible kind of censoriousness. There was an incredible kind of restriction. Um, Even as that was viewed at the same time as a kind of radical opening up for an entire sort of new uh, population of racial, class, ethnic, international players into what had otherwise been a kind of restrictive art world. And so you kind of had these two pictures of where the restrictions existed prior to 2016 or 2014. A predominantly wealthy, largely white, seemingly kind of vaguely left, but largely neoliberal activity of a sort of art world and art market.
Yeah.
Post, let's say, 2012, 2014, increasingly race conscious, identity conscious, globally conscious, class conscious environment that affected both the artists and the institutions that are supporting artwork, sort of opening up in a kind of capacity for more things to enter, yet still a kind of largely neoliberal,
Yeah.
economically driven space. And, you know, Kissick on one side would probably, look at that at the moment before that as the one that he was more interested or happier with. I think, you and your piece look at the moment after that, not necessarily as happier with, but sort of understanding that it has its role to play and is worth embracing or acknowledging and preparing for whatever is to come next. Um, but the the sort of the openness is a kind of interesting problem to get one's mind around, because in an environment where like anything goes, where's the kind of resistance or friction or work that an artist is to use to kind of drive their practice forward. And my concern is that what we get is now a kind of like knee-jerk reaction where the resistance is the kind of hashtag resistance from 2016, and we get back to a lot of like really bad takes on political art. One of the people that you quoted in your Culture of Complaint 2.0 piece, which I really appreciated, was Becca Rothfeld, who said, as long as we don't enter the next 4 years, thinking that it's a great act of truth telling to say that Amanda Gorman is not a particularly good poet, then, maybe we'll get somewhere. But, I think that that's kind of the
And
world.
I got that quote from you because you
I
first
forgot
mentioned
about
it in
that.
your Substack.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Send it along to, yeah. I mean, I appreciate that, but now that you say that, I'm only recalling that that's where it came from. But I think that this is a sort of an interesting problem that we have, because it's, we still exist in a world that's largely US based artists, North American artists,
Yeah.
other than the sort of economic conditions, which always provide a certain kind of struggle, which I think that can just be universalized, saying the economic conditions are the struggle that most people have to kind of contend with in North America, even though it happens to be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, in no comparison to many other countries around the globe. Artists were, some of the best sort of, let's say, advances in form, some of the best advances even in contact have come in places where there have been these restrictions on speech, restrictions on politics, restrictions on what you can and can't say and how those things happen. And perhaps we're entering a moment where, outside of the sort of knee-jerk, superficial political art that we'll have seen, we may be in for a real kind of efflorescence of, important work, where what artists are capable of doing is not addressing this, is not taking this stuff head on, but realizing that they've got to be much more
Responsible.
responsible, but also much more kind of deft and nuanced and like embracing allegory, whereas before it was embracing literalism in such a sort of heady way. And so I'm curious, in your mind, how that comes across both in your sort of critique of what you see as the kind of Kissick mindset, nostalgia, being the kind of primary, position that a lot of critics have, everything was better when, versus sort of what could be exciting about what comes forward.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, maybe God knows. I mean, as things get worse, maybe we're heading into a golden age. I hate the idea of golden age, but yeah, it's entirely possible that uh, one never wants to argue for tough times because tough times are genuinely tough,
Yeah.
right? Across the board. But you may be onto something in saying that, tough times do sometimes produce um, uh, you know, innovations in ideas, innovations in forms, innovation in content. And maybe because there's more skin in the game, those efforts, tend to be and tend to effectively appear be more sincere, um, more direct, franker in their appeals, less beholden to academic citation, to curatorial citation, to curatorial politics, to some of the significant nonsense that's been going on, in it's an important part of exhibition world. I still don't think it's the overwhelming number of institutions or the overwhelming number of biennials even, or the overwhelming number of museum exhibitions that exhibit, really egregious wall text and really one-dimensional, for lack of any other typical medium, and partly because Kissick mentions it, the new sort of regenerated textile world, right? He kind of sociopathically starts that essay talking about how his mother lost her legs basically going to a textile show at the Barbican, um, uh, and basically, figuratively throwing his mom under the bus after she literally fell under the bus. Uh, and yeah, so I've seen that, you've seen that. Any working critic, worth his or her sort of 2 cents has seen that and objected. you know. The other thing that Becca Rothfeld said is that, like, that's happened. That, Kissick is not the first guy to object.
Right.
The problem with Kissick's essay is that, well, there's a number of problems. The main problem for me is that, he plays off like Woolf, like his sort of vaunted predecessor and model, plays off the entire thing, as a comedy of manners. And the art world's a lot of stuff, man. I mean, the art world is the silliest fucking industry I think I can think of. Hollywood's probably first because there's more at stake.
But there's more money, so it's not
There's
as
more
silly.
money. Well, that's what I mean. Or sillier, but in any
Yeah.
event, because of the power differential. But the art world's plenty silly. But there's some serious stuff going on in there. And so, getting the whole picture painted as a, as some kind of like crappy 19th century comedy of manners is not only one dimensional, it's just dumb. It's reductive, you know. And so, and I don't want to spin off into the Kissick sort of like baiting bit here,
No.
because I think I think we may have room for that. And I think you were asking me a different question.
Yeah.
But I went to a show at, oh, now I'm actually forgetting the name of the Cooper Hewitt. There's a triennial on at the Cooper Hewitt. And as I was walking through the show, and there were a couple of very good pieces, which is kind of par for the course for a lot of the biennials I keep seeing in the US. There were a couple of good pieces and then others not so good, all of them cloaked by, reams of exegesis. On the walls at the Cooper Hewitt in particular, put so low that I could only assume, placed so low that I could only assume that they'd made that decision essentially for folks in wheelchairs, for accessibility purposes. But it was like impossible to bloody read. It was like you had to almost squat to read. But the text was often so bad and so slavishly sort of curatorially correct,
Yep.
that not only did it avoid often the issues that were in the work, and repeat almost by rote, things that I had seen in other exhibitions in other cities. But it also sort of struck me that, this is the last time I'm going to see a show like this in many a year, and certainly at a government sort of sponsored institution, because the Cooper Hewitt's part of the Smithsonian.
Right.
And I was then kind of reminded of that op-ed that Tom Frank wrote in the Times, basically the day after the election. So on November 7th, he publishes a piece, and the first paragraph says, "I knew the way the election was going to go when I went to the National Gallery and saw a painting," he doesn't identify which one it is, of a westward wagon trains moving westward.
Yeah.
And it says I knew by, and then read the wall text, which said that it was a painting about settler colonialism.
Right.
There are ways in which stories, and this is what we're battling here. We're battling different interpretations of a single image, right? Single historical image. But there are ways in which you tell a story, in which you genuinely seek to include people even if you're providing alternative narrative. And it seems clear to me in looking at the framework at the Cooper Hewitt, the great majority of it, and in reading this Tom Frank description of why he knew the election was going to go the way it went, describing that piece of Westward Ho as settler colonialism. Just if you purposefully alienate the vast majority of a public with an alternate story, you're not telling the story right.
Right.
You're just simply not.
Right.
And that, I think, is really what's gone wrong in the last decade.
Yeah.
Of curatorial work. From the putative left.
So it's all your fault, you curators.
Yeah, it's all my fault.
I take what you're saying. I think that this has often been one of the great criticisms is not the work, but the way the work is framed, how the work is described, and what the work is taken to present by a sort of more of specifically kind of political agenda driven curation is often the challenge.
And how it illustrates bad ideas, essentially.
Yeah, or it makes the work merely illustrative of something, right? Like reduces the work in all of its complexity, who the artist was, how the artist was producing it, what the context is, and the fact that history itself is nothing if not difficult and nuanced and complex, and to reduce things down to, propagandistic sound bites is a challenge.
Precisely. Or if you go to sort of an earlier sort of like historical debacle, you prevent immensely nuanced works from actually being seen.
Right.
Like the Guston,
right.
Show.
Right.
Which is unconscionable. I mean, I'm still sort of staggered by that decision.
Yeah.
And by the fact that the director of the Ford Foundation, anything you fucking say about it. I mean, honestly, it's not his role to be a spokesperson. Leave it to the directors of museums and curators to do that work. His job is funding or not funding.
Right.
And I found it incredible that he should actually sort of like take, the lead on that kind of messaging, and particularly with that show. Now there's a terrific show with Trenton Doyle Hancock and Guston up now at the Jewish Museum.
Yeah.
But we got, a pasteurized version of what we should have gotten with a Guston show at the National Gallery, and not when we should have gotten it. It read completely differently after all that.
Why do you hate Tom Wolfe?
Because I think he's a fucking Philistine. Because everything's done for a laugh. And again, I just don't think the guy, not enough subtlety, not enough nuance.
Christian, I want to ask you, like, in this context of people sort of reframing what art, what art's intention was, or misinterpreting it, whether that's on accident or because of their own motives or what have you.
Yeah.
So I find it really hilarious, but and I don't know how familiar you are, but the band Rage Against the Machine, I can barely think of a band more political than them, and the message is like super clear, right? And yet you get these people who, like conservatives on Twitter, that see a tweet from the guitar player Tom Morello and suddenly realize that Rage Against the Machine is this leftist band with these revolutionary views, and they're shocked as if they've never heard any of the lyrics or actually paid attention to what the message was. And I was wondering if you could think of any artists, visual artists, whose work you believe is very political with a clearly defined viewpoint, and yet they garner a lot of appreciation for people on the other side of the political coin because those people just don't see the message in the work.
Yeah, the answer is yes, and for some reason having trouble sort of like finding who. I want to go back to Goya because like Orwell, he's a guy who's used for a lot of there are a lot of people who use Goya, in the way the Bible's sort of quoted, You got your favorite verse or you got your favorite painting, and you can point to, some of the black paintings and imagine in the same way that you can point to like 1984 and say that that's largely about that's exclusively about um, the experience of totalitarianism under the Soviet Union. Um, I think with Goya, you get some of those sort of one-dimensional readings that often sort of ignore, well, in his case, Spanish history, um, and the Napoleonic Wars and the detail that's in there, right? The fact that like he's essentially, at least with the disasters of war, talking to, the experience of the first guerrilla war. And in fact, come to think of it, as I'm talking to you, um, a lot of Goya's activity, including some works, were actually sort of, if not commissioned, tolerated. Some very political works, like May the Second and May the Third, were either commissioned or tolerated by monarchs, and some of them, quite reactionary. So that's a case in which not just posthumously, but during the man's lifetime, work was sort of significantly misunderstood. Um,
Going back to your Mexican mural example, Rivera's Rockefeller Commission.
oh yeah, of course. Yeah. Thanks for that,
You
man.
know,
You literally got me out of a jam there. Totally.
Rockefeller commissioning Rivera because, the popularity of Mexican muralism and Rivera's, global kind of reputation at the time, and thinking this would be a fantastic work to have at the headquarters in New York City. And then, taking a look at it and be like, wait a second, this
What's Lenin?
radical,
What are Lenin and Stalin
yeah,
doing
yeah,
there?
yeah, this radical leftist storyboard that I just put up inside of my, cathedral to capitalism, and this thing has to go. I would think in contemporary art today, you'd maybe the only person I can imagine maybe be someone like Julie Moretu, although I think there the politics are much more muted, but she's got a big
That's a great
piece that
example.
that is that adorns Goldman Sachs, right? I mean, it's like,
Deutsche Bank. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
her work, that's actually you should have, I should just let you answer this question because you've nailed it in both cases. No, Mayor Retu's work is um, largely for a market that is, the large institutions, banks in particular, financial services companies, they love her stuff. And she paints them at scale,
Oh my
at
God.
like huge lobby scale,
Yeah,
you know. So I don't think the people who commission those works or who buy those works are entertaining the idea that these are critiques of capitalism, though I think she intends them to be as such, or at least the curators who put her works in, institutional exhibitions basically say that that's what they are.
that's right. They're very capable of code switching.
And that is essentially what it is. It's big time code switching, you know.
Yeah. Um, Along those lines, I got one other question that maybe we'll head towards our final segment. Um, in your piece and in one of your critiques of Kissick, you talk about this kind of um, as if to sort of ignore the sort of rise of the market, or sort of how much money has been sloshing around in the contemporary art world over the last decade, is to kind of uh, uh, miss the forest for the trees type of critique, right? Like that, calling out certain biennial exhibitions, largely in Europe, a kind of way of presenting work, a kind of rise of identitarianism, a kind of rise of a liberal censoriousness, all things, as you mentioned, that people have mentioned, have noted before, have taken, have lamented in their ways, but not to equate that, or not to look at that at the same time as the the Maurizio Catalan banana going for millions of dollars at auction, and the billions of dollars that are trading hands all the time. My question to you is that I actually see those as the same thing, to be quite honest, right? I mean, I think that
How
the
so?
Well, the rise of a kind of, and I don't think this is not my argument necessarily, but the kind of rise of identitarian-based work and the rise of a kind of political frame would has been argued it's absolutely coincidental with the kind of
I see where
neoliberal
you're going. I see where you're
inflation
going.
inflation of the art market,
It
right? I mean,
happened
these things,
it happened in 1982.
yeah, and these things are not, they're either two sides of the same coin. I would say that they are actually very much the same coin, right? And you have kind of old school lefties in my mind of like the Walter Ben Michaels and the Adolph Reed Juniors who have been saying like, this identity politics is really just the conscience of the neoliberal right, and everybody's basically in the same boat, paddling in the same direction. They might just be on the left and right hand side, pulling the oars, for the distribution of capital upwards towards the ownership class. And Kissick fails to make that argument, but I don't think that I don't think it's a failure of the critique necessarily, right? It's just, it was sort of looking at that in one direction. And I think, if you are left or right, I mean, I think that there's a real argument for, and there people have been making this argument for the last 10 years, right? Like we are missing class, we are missing. Right? Like class is the thing we can't talk about. Class
No,
is the
no.
thing
I
that the
mean,
art world is incapable of acknowledging
no, but it's not
because,
just the art world.
well, everybody,
And
right? But it's particularly difficult in the art world, right? Because the institutions, the mechanisms of power, these are things that are sort of as, not to bring Greenberg back into it again, but so inextricably tied by the umbilical cord of gold, right?
well,
Like,
but it's also because it's the art world is a symbol making machine. That is its function,
yeah,
right? But the entire society, from the 1930s forward, basically did away with class,
right.
did away with a class critique. And so what you're left with in lieu of that, is binary identitarianism.
But don't you think that Tom, don't you think that that is actually one of the places that recuperates Wolf, is that much of his work was at least a calling out of the kind of class divisions or the papering over of class divisions that pertain in the United States in a way that it becomes a comedy of manners because those manners are good manners around the issue of class, even if they've become bad manners around the issues of identity.
Yeah, but a critique, listen, a comedy of manners is not a critique of, is not economic, it's not a class critique. And a comedy of manners, as entertaining as it might be, you know, only sheds some light. It's, I really think my problem with Wolf has always been that he's in for the mean-spirited fucking laugh, and really, I don't remember ever reading a line of his that made me see a piece, even the slightest smidgen of empathy, in his writing. I do think that's part of a bigger critique. Orwell could. That's the difference.
Sure.
And for me, that's why someone like Orwell is a guy that I want to go back to over and over again. There is a studied, absolutely polished meanness in Orwell, and not just in 1984, and many other things he wrote, including his essays. But there's a genuine critique there. It's not just about a comedy matters. Listen, I mean, I think you have a point. And as you were talking, I was dialing up to remember Daniel Joseph Martinez's name from the 1992 Whitney Biennial. Yeah, the sort of
It's my favorite work.
I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. I'm sure you've got it framed in your bedroom. I can't
The
the
museum
metal
tag.
the metal sort of museum tags. I can't imagine
Can't imagine ever wanting to be white. Yeah.
Precisely, exactly. You can't get more identitarian than that, which is, partly why I call the voice essay, the cultural complaint 2.0, because we've been down this road before. And
Sure.
you're absolutely right in sort of pointing out that this reaction happened at a time when the market had been going apeshit for a bit, right? And you had neo-expressionism around, for example, which might be some kind of, louder, I would say better equivalent to the kind of work that Kissick seems to be interested in. He's very vague about and very unspecific about work by any of his contemporaries the only point in which he gets specific is in talking about the Viennese actionists, who, by the way, like
Yeah.
honestly, meh, like who gives a shit about the Viennese actionists? You know, aside from the fact that like almost to a man, they're like fucking convicted pedos. I mean, like what in the out of like I part of me wants to actually go to Harper's office and ask them, what the fuck were you thinking
Well, that
in
was my, yeah.
publishing this thing? First, the intro, which I really genuinely think is absolutely sociopathic. I mean, like for what effect? To what effect? And then the stuff about like, yeah, the Viennese actionists. Google Viennese actionism. You know, see what happened to those artists.
Yeah, I agree with you. I still
It's
hold
not
that.
exactly a North Star, either
No,
aesthetically, or ethically.
no. I still hold that
Totally unacknowledged.
Dean was not served well by his editors. I will give Dean credit that, in the aftermath, and people have asked him, who are the people, who are the artists that you're actually for, and he has come forward with plenty of examples, and so he's willing to do it.
Okay.
He will say that the piece got cut, there in the interest of space, and the piece had ended on exactly that note in terms of, here are the artists who he thought were doing very interesting work today and giving it a direction, and that was cut by the editors. And again, I will say that just means the editors need, he'll defend his editors, but I still think that's indefensible.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And as like you, as somebody who's faces editors with some regularity, yeah, I know the way in which
how
arguments can be truncated by editors.
The sausage
but
gets made.
But exactly, sausage gets made. But let me ask you this. I mean, do you remember any of those artists off the top of your head?
Pierre Huyghe is the only one that I recall in terms of the work from the biennial, in that biennial in particular.
Yeah.
But I've got a list of them somewhere else. But I don't want Dean to suffer that criticism. But I think he's been willing to come out and show what he is for. But at any rate,
well, but listen, 2016 is also, and that was sort of the golden age. I mean, which is kind of funny because, like, how old is this kid? That's your golden age, 2016. It also happened to coincide, not so incidentally, with like the fucking height of like zombie formalism.
Yeah.
So
a friend of mine always says that you can always tell that like middle-aged guys always start dressing like they did when they were in their 20s or like in college, because those were the best years of their lives. It's when they have their midlife crisis, they go back to dressing that way.
Yeah.
All right. So maybe we'll leave that one there. We'll go on. We've got a series of questions we like to ask all the people who come on the podcast. A little bit more rapid fire as we'll come close to time here. So first question, if you had a budget, don't go nuts, of $10 million, what is a enterprise, business, initiative, organization, something that you would start that would have to be unrelated to some of the projects that you're currently involved in? So for example, you can't simply, give the $10 million budget to the Contemporary Art Museum in Florida and decide that you're going to get yourself a nice curatorial salary and begin doing a bunch of shows. What is a project or something that you would like to embark upon that a $10 million budget would give you the opportunity to do?
I mean, at this point, the first thing that comes to mind is to PEN America, to essentially or any organization that I could identify that was going to push back against the kind of censorship I think we're about to come in for.
Would you start your own organization? I mean, that's more sort of what we're interested in terms of like more sort of entrepreneurial minded. Would you take a $10 million budget and sort of,
Yes.
Or
I think that's. I think I would do that with the caveat that I would actually sort of want to do it from the visual arts and also from writing, not necessarily writing my own writing, but publishing criticism, because criticism is having a very, very difficult time getting published these days.
Yeah.
As we know.
Right? A new journal of criticism. I like it. Sign me up.
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
All right, next question. Is there an initiative or someone out there who's doing interesting work that you would like to call particular attention to right now? Could be a curator, could be a museum, could be an arts organization, could be a company, founder, anything you wanna point to that other people should take note of, that we should be taking note of.
Man, I wish you'd sent me these before because I would have had better answers. But I give you a good answer, or hopefully a couple of good answers. There's an artist named Amy, and this is down in my neck of the woods, or where I am about 30% of the time in Florida. Amy Rosenblum Martin is doing a really interesting, again, Latinx show, all commissioned at the Ringling Museum in where's it, Sarasota? And that just looks like a terrific show. So she very much deserves a shout out. Yeah.
Nice. That's good. All right. Last question.
Shoot.
If you could steal any work of art or cultural artifact to have for yourself, you could share it with you and your family, but you couldn't let anybody else know that you have it, what would you take?
Deal. The Prado's May the 3rd. Boy is May the 3rd. I don't know where I'd hang it. I don't have the walls. I live in a New York apartment. Failing that, a suite of the disasters of war. I have a soft spot for Robert Hughes, basically because, I think he was our last encyclopedic critic. He got a lot of shit wrong, particularly as he got older. He just literally couldn't stand contemporary art. But I know he had a suite in his home, and that was the only art that he had. And I have a Capriccio that I bought in Madrid sometime back, about a decade ago. Yeah, Goya. Goya gets me going.
Nice. Christian, thank you very much for coming on the
Thank
MO
you, guys.
podcast.
Thank you guys so much. And one last word to Joey. You're Oaxaca, Francisco Toledo. There's a guy who was also doing socially engaged art about La Letra while making pictures. Anyway, thank you guys so much.
Thanks, Christian.
It's been fun. Cheers.